Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker lacks substance, and for a universe that I know has infinite potential within the rules that it has set for itself, the missed potential and lack thereof is frustrating. One of my favorite things about Star Wars as a whole is how much world building has been done to set the rules of the universe, but not so much that new things can't be created and expanded upon. If we're talking about all things related to Star Wars, there are plenty of books that I remember reading that delved into events that, at least before the newest trilogy, could very well have been canonical pieces. Most notably, aside from some recurring characters and planet names, the stories are completely made up from the Star Wars framework, but they almost never fell out of place from that framework. Among these examples, I specifically remember a series set roughly 30 years after the Return of the Jedi that follows the story of Han Solo and Leia's twin children. I only had 2 of the books, but a quick Google search shows that there's 14?! This and countless other pieces of literature that filled in the gaps of time left in between the movies were enriching, even if they had been renounced as not canonical by George Lucas and further buried by Disney. Heck, even if we're not counting books, there's also the Clone Wars and Mandalorian TV series, both of which are equally separate in their own ways from the films, but connected by the world that they're set in. My point being that any of these stories created under the Star Wars Legends banner in the 38 years that it had time to do so proved that Star Wars had so many perfect templates for creating any number of compelling stories with bombastic finales. But in return, we got The Rise of Skywalker. One good thing that I can say about Rise of Skywalker is that it is visually impressive at times. All 3 of the films, really. Each one of the sequel trilogy films has at least one sequence that stands out in my mind. In The Force Awakens, it's when Rey is descending the hollowed-out Star Destroyer or the lightsaber fight in the forest towards the end of the movie. In The Last Jedi, it's the rickety old speeders flying out of the planet's salt surface and revealing the thinly veiled red rock underneath, or the erupting Star Destroyers following Holdo's kamikaze. In The Rise of Skywalker, it would have to be the scene at the end on the ocean planet. The rest, it moves too fast to let me dwell on much of it, but that's a point for later in the video. The sheer sense of scale on display in each of these scenes is unlike anything that we've been able to see in Star Wars before, since the original trilogy was limited to technology of the time, and the prequels were suffering the side effects of early 2000s CGI. Contrary to some opinions shared by my friends, I think that the casting for these films has been perfectly fine. John Boyega is the absolute standout for me, and the rest of the cast does fine with the script that they've been given. Even Adam Driver's long, narrow face, that seems unfitting, fits well into his role of being a wimpy Sith wannabe. No offense meant to the guy, of course. Beyond all the negativity and frustration that I have and will be sharing throughout the rest of this video, I also fully recognize and can appreciate that Star Wars has been a campy and fun series since its inception. I mean, my god, we're talking about the most defining science fiction IP of the last half century, and it basically boils down to how a bunch of space wizards fight each other with nothing but telekinesis and dangerous glow sticks. Even though the prequels tried to take themselves more seriously, they are still funny in a way because of how cheesy they look now. And the same applies here to some extent, and that's to say that if there are people out there that say, hey, I thought that the movie was fun, then I'm right there with you. There are dumb fun elements to be had here and enjoyed because dumb fun is what Star Wars has always done really well. I'm not going to be the guy that stands in front of the television and refuses to let anyone play Rise of Skywalker because I think it's a poorly made film for the budget it was given. But if someone asks me what I think is wrong with the movie though, I'd probably tell them something like, if The Rise of Skywalker were likened to a meal, I'd say that it's all starch and cheap, simple carbohydrates, all potatoes, no meat, which only serves to fatten and increase blood sugar without balancing out with some protein and dietary fiber. This analogy doesn't make any sense yet, but let me explain. The Rise of Skywalker is the ultimate movie that consists of things happening, yet despite the many crucial plot points and potential pieces of development that its script passes over, none of it is given any weight. I partially attribute this to how the movie preceding it, The Last Jedi, simultaneously had the same problem and the exact opposite problem. Things that happened in The Last Jedi. We were introduced to a new leader in the form of Admiral Holdo, Rose was a new character who accompanied Finn to the casino location, Poe Dameron struggles to be a competent leader in light of his pride, the Resistance attempts to flee the approaching threat of the First Order, and Snoke, who eventually dies, and Rey began training with Luke Skywalker. Yet by the end of TLJ, every single one of these vitally important points that could have been expanded upon further in the following film is either killed off or assassinated by the screenplay. Holdo. Rose and Finn have a throwaway line and learn absolutely nothing, but at least we know that Finn is very nice to animals and that animal cruelty is bad. Luke. Poe Dameron doesn't really change at all. Snoke. And finally, the ever-looming threat of the First Order being right behind the Resistance. Yeah, they're still there. 2.5 hours of movie later, they're still effectively in the same exact position that they were before. Everything that could have been set up for The Rise of Skywalker was shot down or went nowhere, leaving the movie with way too much to do and only one film's length to do it. I genuinely like to believe that it was the filmmaker's intention to ease the audience into a grand finale using the characters that were established to then create a properly climactic end to this narrative. The problem is, with all the characters that the trilogy sets up at the beginning and expands upon in the second movie, there are far too many unresolved resolutions that this 9th and final film was unfortunately compelled to answer. The reason why I feel like I can believe that the filmmaker is trying to make this film an epic finale is due to how self-referential the movie is and how many big reveals were dropped during its runtime. At breakneck speed, we go from the Resistance somehow escaping the Salt Planet, to Leia dying due to Carrie Fisher's unfortunate death prior to filming, to Poe Dameron has an ex-girlfriend sequence that was mostly forgettable, to a big space battle with everyone in the galaxy and defeating Emperor Palpatine, who makes an inexplicable return from death. Palpatine's possible return might have been hinted at in The Revenge of the Sith when he tells Anakin that a Sith Lord held mastery over life and death, but in that context we're more led to believe that this was a lie told by Palpatine to sway Anakin's allegiance rather than something either one of them truly believed to be possible. By letting Palpatine return, it further diminishes the tragic villain arc that Anakin was set on, because instead of being converted as a result of his own greed and naivety, Anakin is instead indirectly treated as an insignificant pawn. An evil angle, for sure. Yet an angle that nearly invalidates all of the screen time that the character had before. The Knights of Ren also show up briefly. Yep, if any one of these big reveals were given the time that they needed, like, say, a gradual reveal over the entire trilogy, they would have made for some at least partially competent climaxes to the story or endings to specific characters' own timelines. The escape from the Salt Planet could have been a great high point to start the film off of, but instead it's basically relegated to the opening crawl. Actually, it's not even in the opening crawl, we're just led to assume that they've gotten off the planet through the power of movie magic. Star Wars films have always ended with momentum, but never on an outright cliffhanger or in the middle of the action. The off-screen development that we're given to read in the opening credits explains how the conflict for the current film starts and takes the time to briefly gloss over the more mundane but albeit more important story points. Take the last paragraph of the crawl from A New Hope, for example. Through this paragraph alone, we understand that the Empire possesses a deadly weapon of unfathomable destruction, which is important for setting up A New Hope. What we don't see and what we don't need to see is the construction or diplomacy that goes into creating it. So what does The Rise of Skywalker's opening crawl say? Most of these things are things that we already know because of the last film. And number two, this leaves basically no resolution to the ending of The Last Jedi. The Resistance is about to die. They are about to be entirely snuffed out, yet the most that we get in regards to that between the end of the last film and the last period in Rise of Skywalker's opening crawl is nothing. The end result is a film that spends most of its runtime like an abruptly timed TV show, wherein different acts are basically different character episodes. Unlike a TV series that has character-specific episodes though, there's not enough time to develop that kind of story, and none of these characters have been written to be side characters since the beginning of the trilogy. The Rise of Skywalker then has to make an active choice to either switch its focus off of Rey and develop someone else's story primarily, since Rey hasn't changed much at all anyway, or go more all in on Rey's story and let other characters supplement. I choose both at the same time, which is what it does, and that ends up serving to its detriment. One of the greatest elements of the original trilogy and even the prequels lies in how the main characters are fallible. Luke and Anakin, both prone to anger and reckless behavior, which lands them in situations where they both get their asses handed to them. The writing in both of these sequences is relatively campy, and Yoda fighting Dooku in this one in particular made a younger Kai nearly cry from laughter, but considering the more nonchalant and goofy tone of the originals, this gradual change culminating in one of the most humiliating defeats of a main character was a real representation of Luke's need to overcome his own pride. Rey, on the other hand, never really experiences this. While it would have been boring to see the exact same story played out again, that's not the point that I'm making. I want to see Rey lose a fight that she actively sought. I want to see Rey's harsh upbringing actively reflected in her character to the point where the people that initially believed in her as the last hope for peace start to doubt her at some point. The setup was right there, and it was discarded to instead make her a flawless female parody of Luke Skywalker. Even with the lack of options being explored in her character, almost like she was shoehorned into the main character role without any prior considerations to her development, there are still several moments in the films as they are now where the opportunity to have her make the wrong decisions and reap the consequences was there. Since one of the themes of this video ties into what this movie had to do to undo all the mess of the previous film to reach a completely different conclusion than what was clearly set up, I'm going to point back to a point I've made previously about The Last Jedi. And that point is that there is far too much going on in terms of storylines. Like, every character was vying for the spot of main character, yet none of them were offered ample screen time to set a clear favorite that offered clean transitions between acts. Rey is the primary victim of the same bloated writing, where she's clearly meant to be the main character for this trilogy, but there are so many other main characters. By the time we get to the point of the movie where Rey needs to have developed a certain skill necessary for a combat sequence or use some unfathomable amount of the Force to overcome an obstacle, there hasn't been enough time spent on her in either of the previous two films to validate the reasons why she's able to do things now. When it comes to dodging Kylo Ren's TIE fighter, she just does. When it comes to Force healing, which we never seen used in any of the previous mainline installments or spin-off cartoon series, it seems awfully convenient for no good reason that Rey knows how to do it on the spot. Heck, if we even reference the 2003 animated things where Anakin goes through that trial of pain, you would think that maybe the most powerful Jedi that we might actually know would have used Force healing in this sequence. Maybe I'm just crazy for thinking that. There is an instance in one of the books where one of the main characters uses the Force to slowly mend their wounds while they're being tortured, but as we have already established though, the books aren't canon, and it would make even less sense for this movie to pull from an unreliable source to fill in the gaps of an already tattered story. One scene that I can point to that best highlights Rey's wasted potential as a character is the scene where we are led to believe that Chewbacca is dead. Chewbacca, who is at this point the last living bastion of the original cast, is captured by the First Order, and in a fit of rage, Rey shoots out Force lightning, something we've only seen villains do in the movies, and the ship holding Chewbacca explodes in midair. For the tone of the rest of the movie where everything goes right for Rey, this is a sudden and stark contrast, and the first time where we can say that she's gone too far. It's also the first time that we've really seen her have any sort of meaningful character development, since she's been the stand here and do this to solve her problem character since the first movie. Sure, it took them long enough, and giving Rey this fatal flaw was refreshing for the character. I know it's not exactly original, but hey, after several hours of film preceding this moment, it was an unexpected break from the monotony. And then Chewbacca just shows up later, because apparently he didn't die. Somehow. If you're keeping score at home, that's two characters now in the series that this film has assassinated by reviving other characters. At the end of the sequel trilogy, all that we've learned about Rey is that she's a very strong Jedi because of her familial connections, which I will get to later, and that she's had basically everything handed to her with only minor roadblocks along the way. I mean, yeah, the roadblocks themselves aren't minor, but with the way that she handles them in the films, they are regarded as minor. There's no weight to them, and strangely enough, it makes it seem like Rey never has a choice in the matter. I'm from Texas, y'all. There's no weight to them, and strangely enough, it makes it seem like Rey never has a choice in the matter. She is Miss Goody Two-Shoes that really empathizes and cares about people, even though her upbringing involved her being sold off by her parents as a slave and was forced to adapt to surviving by herself on a desert planet. But nah, she has no bitterness towards humanity. When Rey is brought aboard the ship on Jakku, why does she immediately trust the people she's with, that they're also not planning on selling her into a worse situation? Why does she not try to take something valuable for herself, for example? When Rey is training with Luke to improve her Force powers, I often wondered if there was any reason for her to return to the Resistance outside of being written to be eerily empathetic. Look, if I keep writing new branching ideas for this character, I'm going to be writing fanfiction, so I'll leave it at the idea that there was a lot of setup for Rey that wasn't used because nobody seemed to know who they wanted the main character to be. Speaking of not knowing who the main character is, let's talk about Finn. The Force Awakens opens on some powerful and straightforward imagery. Finn, a young stormtrooper in the First Order, watches his leader and commanders slaughter a helpless group of Resistance stragglers. One of the victims, dying on the ground out of shot, reaches up and grabs Finn's helmet, leaving a bloody handprint behind. Yeah, so my apologies, I actually got this wrong. This is obviously not a resistance straggler. This is another one of the stormtroopers, and the ultimate message of this scene is to tell people that war is just terrible for both sides, and Finn doesn't want to be involved in such a trade that's bloody. But I still think that my points, regardless of who's dead in this scene, still impact what I have to say afterwards. But I'm totally wrong on saying this, and I do apologize for that. Finn panics as he realizes the true nature of the work he's been coerced into, and resolves to escape the First Order so that he can do something right by the universe. It just so happens that when he does escape, he's intercepted by Poe Dameron, and their romance begins. Nah, I'm just kidding. This would have been Disney's 47th first gay character, and we all know how that goes. Thanks to this opening sequence and the events that follow it, we now have a character with believable motivation who starts off with unsure footing and has a clear end goal in sight. And that end goal being facing Captain Phasma, who is a physical manifestation of everything that Finn feared he would become, meaning that defeating her would be symbolic for Finn in more ways than one. For one, defeating her would be symbolic of Finn's growth in terms of his overall strength. Whether that means his own mental strength improved and he was talented all along, or whether that means he was trained and grew physically, doesn't really matter, it's the conclusion that does. And for two, defeating her would also mean that Finn has truly left his past behind, and he is ready to surge forward as a force for good and hope and whatever sentimental words I can come up with here. You know, every time something sounds cheesy, I'm just gonna tap this sign here. John Boyega also delivers a stout performance in this film, and although his yelling can be a little over the top at times, it's the excitement of those scenes that really grounds the intensity in his comedic relief role. Finn is what I consider to be more of the heart of the films, carried entirely off of his naivety and nervousness, which gradually grows into shaky confidence by the end of The Force Awakens. This scene here, where Finn holds the lightsaber to fend off Kylo Ren, is one of the best character moments that this trilogy has to offer. Even though he's brushed aside a mere few seconds later, the seconds that Finn spends standing there with his lightsaber, staring down his former leader, speaks volumes for how much the character has improved emotionally. Him getting knocked aside only serves to make him a better character, as the action communicates that Finn still has a lot to learn if he wants to face Kylo Ren. It's the movie's way of saying that this isn't Finn's fight, it's Rey's, despite the fact that aside from getting knocked out mere seconds prior, Rey has not taken a significant hit up to and past this point. Phasma is a more important fight for Finn, which is really weird to me considering how she's handled. So, Phasma is taken hostage and then brushed aside in The Force Awakens, not by Finn alone, but mostly through the efforts of Han Solo and Chewbacca. Finn is there, and maybe this means that he's learning to depend on other people, but considering how the series has handled Rey so far, I tend to doubt it. Then, in The Last Jedi, while the Star Destroyer that Finn and Rose are on is breaking apart, Phasma gets the upper hand on Finn for a second before... And that's it. No real concerted effort of Finn standing up to her, or perhaps having a close fight, because he takes the short end of the stick here for sure. It's just... nothing. At the exact moment where Phasma falls into the void of space, so does Finn's character development. TLJ gives us one last chance for Finn to become a powerful character in the moment where he's driving the rickety speeder into the laser drill in an attempt to suicide bomb it, which would again be another great way to make this character come full circle. Previously, he was marching and following orders to kill the resistance, and now he was acting of his own accord to save those that so many of his compatriots had slain. One last hurrah, proving that Finn was truly unafraid now of those that he once fought for. And then Rose comes flying in and says, "Hey, we need you on screen in the next movie. Forget your development, we'll have Rey here in a few seconds to solve everything for us." I suspect it's a contract thing against poorly thought out writing. We're now at 3 characters that the trilogy has ruined by resurrecting or stopping them moments before death for no discernible reason. Finn could have been a great character if he was allowed to do anything here, just like Rey or Poe or anyone else. This section is titled "Because of Course It Does," as a sarcastic statement to put at the end of sentences where I don't know what to analyze aside from pointing out the sheer ridicule and lack of forethought on display. It's also the forward analysis that I can give you about the Rise of Skywalker, because if I told you something like, Rey was Palpatine's granddaughter all along, you'd probably reply with something like, "Oh, well, of course she is." I'm no longer surprised. I'm exasperated. Mainly what I've been trying to get across is that this final film is a Forgettable mess. Oh hey, I said the title of the video, which is entirely credited to how its story for what I considered to be its two largest characters was mishandled. With said mishandling, different directors pulling in multiple different directions across the trilogy, and the original director of The Rise of Skywalker bowing out completely to make way for J.J. Abrams' overcreated differences, it's not hard to understand even at a surface level why this movie was terrible. If you look at the filming section for this film on Wikipedia, it's very clear that the production on this was panicked and directionless, and I laugh now because it means that Disney has another L on its table, though I do feel kinda bad for the people involved. Principal photography began on August 1st, 2018, which puts the filming hardly 16 months before the release of the film. Due to the tight schedule, some editing took place on set. Scenes detailing Palpatine's return were altered and changed during production. The kiss between Rey and Ben was initially going to be excluded from the film until Abrams decided against it at the last minute. After principal photography wrapped 6 months later in February of 2019, there were 2 weeks of reshoots involving Mark Hamill, Daisy Ridley, and Oscar Isaac in July of 2019. Another round of reshoots took place between late September and mid-October. And most hilarious of all, Last Minute ADR was recorded with Adam Driver, in which he recorded his lines in a closet. I'm sure that this mess of production happens all the time with films, and it does, according to an interview with J.J. Abrams that was published a month before Rise of Skywalker came out. We had more reshoots on episode 7 than this one, Abrams says. We had more story adjustments on 7 than this one. We didn't know if these characters would work, if the actors would be able to carry a Star Wars movie. There were a lot of things we didn't know. On this, we knew who and what worked, and everyone is doing the best work I have ever seen anyone do, but the ambition of this movie is greater than Force Awakens. What we set out to do was far more challenging. Everything is exponentially larger on this, which is a fancy way of saying, hey man, we're just doing our best with what corporate has allowed us to do. Another article written by Cinema Blend in December of 2019 reports that the director says the movie has been seen but never by a test audience, and that J.J. Abrams goes on record to say, of course I've shown it at a friends and family screening, but we've never done like a test screening. No test screenings is usually a pretty bad sign for mega corporations, as the practice is only heard of when the movie is generally regarded with an air of non-confidence. All in all, it's funny to me that the largest film production company in the world looks so disorganized because of the end result that is The Rise of Skywalker. Let's start from the top. The Last Jedi ends with the Resistance being nearly overwhelmed by the First Order, only to be delayed by Luke Skywalker's final efforts, and Rey shows up as well to show that she's reunited with them. Logically, the next progression of the story would be to see the Resistance possibly on the tail end of this encounter, if not still in the middle of it. Nope. Instead, The Rise of Skywalker starts with Kylo Ren massacring a group of hooded alien figures, gee, history sure likes to repeat itself, to contain this box full of whispers. I know it's a J.J. Abrams trope to have some mystery box, but we really don't have time for that discussion right now. The whisper box tells Kylo that Emperor Palpatine is sitting over here in his pimped out armchair, which Kylo goes to immediately with the intent of killing this threat to his own power. In response, Palpatine puts on a nice puppet show that looks like a bunch of Star Destroyers and tells Kylo that he can offer him everything.
Who is she?
Oh yeah, Palpatine f***s. That's all the time we have for that interaction. This movie was made practically overnight in movie terms, so we have to go. Speaking of go, where did the Resistance go? Well, here's 3 of the leading characters playing chess. Oh, but the chess game is going to wait because now they have to get encrypted information downloaded into R2-D2, which is alleged information from a spy within the First Order. Quick, there's a time limit. We're hitting the cliche where the loading bar is going to finish in the nick of time before they get blown to smithereens by the squadron of TIE fighters. Someone mention another character so that we can segue into the next section.
Rey's not here, is she?
Hello, Rey. Nice to see you. Have we mentioned that we have to show a few seconds of screen time for every individual main character in this movie, otherwise their contract budgets are going to be wasted? This is all within the first few minutes of the film, and despite the immediate peril that Finn and Poe find themselves in, the rest of the Resistance is inexplicably doing just fine. Unfortunately for us, The Rise of Skywalker continues at this breakneck pace for the remaining 2 hours, and it feels like a fever dream. So, funny story, I remember my grandmother being particularly frustrated by this film, because when she was younger, she saw A New Hope. And in that movie, they destroyed the Death Star, right? And a few years later, Return of the Jedi comes out. They destroy the Death Star again. And then we took her to see Rogue One, which was the plans to destroy the Death Star. And then in this movie, they destroy the Death Star again. And so for her, it's really hard to distinguish that this one is different from this one, but this one from this movie is the same as this one from this movie, and this one is totally separate. The sequel trilogy set itself up for recycling content basically as soon as we saw Starkiller Base and Kylo Ren's suit design. Unlike how the prequels worked out, there wasn't any effort being made on expanding the lore of the universe, only retelling the same story with a slightly different coat of paint. For whatever reason, the script felt it was necessary to also hit all the points on the Star Wars bingo card in order to usher in the sloppy conclusion to all these character arcs, ending the Skywalker saga, so to speak. What I don't understand is why there even had to be an ending to the Skywalker saga to begin with, since The Return of Jedi seemed like a perfectly satisfactory way to end it. 6 whole movies were dedicated to the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker, along with his defeat by his own son, which also goes through some character transformation throughout the trilogy that he's involved in. Bringing Luke back in the capacity that they did is insulting, since it didn't really feel like a series of films that were meant to be about him. The parallel that I can think of is Yoda, who was prominent in the prequels, and then some old Force-sensitive whack job in the originals, but we don't go about calling those prequel movies the Yoda saga. In fact, finding a Jedi Master was the tertiary point, or a point along Luke's storyline, rather than the whole reason for 3 movies to exist. It's a hard comparison to make because of how much revolves around Luke and Leia in the first 6 films, but if you want my opinion, I still think there was room to do something completely different here. The insult to Luke's legacy is heightened even more by the ending of this particular movie, where Rey calls herself Rey Skywalker. I'm happy that Rey feels like she can belong to a family, which is probably all that the line is supposed to mean. Considering all the information preceding the line, though, it feels more like a statement that's supposed to lead into 3 more movies, and it feels incredibly vapid as a result. It's the most recognizable science fiction IP to date. Do you really think Disney is going to ignore it? Here's a rapid-fire round of large events that happen in the film, and they're somewhat out of order. The Resistance finds a knife inscribed with ancient Sith text, which C-3PO conveniently can't translate since it's against his programming. Luckily, there's a droid smith on another planet that they can take C-3PO to in order to get his brain reset and the next part of the scavenger hunt uncovered. In the process, our heroes find out that the planet has already been taken over by the First Order, and they run the city where the droid smith lives with an iron fist. C-3PO has his head reset, his eyes go red, and he delivers the message just in the nick of time. Oh yeah, also on this planet is this woman who had a previous romantic interest for Poe, and they exchange some will they, won't they dialogue before we find out later that the planet is blown to smithereens while the heroes are on their next fetch quest. Oh, but don't worry, the girlfriend and the droid smith survive, leaving us with a 4th character assassinated by the screenplay by refusing to let another integral person die. I know that I've been keeping count and that I've already had my sections about Finn and Rey, so I'll make this one quick. Poe Dameron is a good pilot. Possibly the best out of the pilots that we know now, and he knows it. He wears his skill like a badge on his chest and often flaunts his own prowess by acting like he knows better when sometimes his own arrogance makes him blind to the plight of the people around him. At the start of The Last Jedi, Leia confronts Poe about losing several pilots in an already dwindling squadron, saying that his arrogance comes at a great personal cost. Later, in The Rise of Skywalker, Leia dies, having always believed in Poe's ability if he could just stop thinking about himself all the time, and their relationship is kind of ambiguous and a weight on Poe's shoulders. In The Last Jedi, we're introduced to Vice Admiral Holdo, a character that I dislike, and you can see why in this actually, maybe not. Holdo was an illogical, frustrating character who never communicated clearly with her officers and caused more indirect death and chaos than she probably intended. At the end of her life, though, she had to execute a suicide maneuver in order to cover Poe's mistakes, showing that she cared despite her brusque behavior. Once again, showing that Poe's arrogance came at a great personal cost. So logically, after 2 superiors have directly influenced him and given him pretty much the same spiel, doesn't it seem weird that there is once again a character's death, but not actual death, that puts its metaphorical hand on Poe's shoulder and says that his arrogance comes at a great personal cost? It's just the same point being made over again, and the fact that she comes back later in the film is regressive character development. Why? Following Leia's death, Finn becomes the leader for the Resistance, and I don't agree with the decision. Up to this point, and not counting the ending of The Last Jedi, since his heroic moment was cut short and he was planning on dipping anyway, Finn doesn't seem very well suited to being a leader from what we know about him. The role is handed over to him based on pure nepotism. I mean, surely there has to be someone else in the Resistance that's a better fit for the role, like how we saw Holdo pop out of nowhere. Billy D. Williams reprises his role as Lando Calrissian in this movie, and while I have nothing against the guy, you and I know it's entirely for the "oh my gosh, that's Lando, wow, what a great movie, I love Disney" moment where everyone is supposed to stand up and clap at the movie screen. Rey's past is revealed, and we learn that she is a direct descendant of Palpatine, which makes me groan aloud when I heard it the first time. It still does. She's a complete Mary Sue character at this point. What other terms am I supposed to use about a character who is so all-powerful that she can perform insurmountable tasks without training, never takes a hit, and wins all of her fights handily, and also just so happens to be the granddaughter of the most powerful living Sith? And she's just great friends with everybody too. I want to die. Force healing. Moving on. Palpatine, sitting in his totally sick armchair, tries to roll a deception check on Rey and gets an 18, but unlucky for him, Rey rolls a 20 on perception. She always rolls 20s. The final fight is meant to be this super cosmic, epic battle of good versus evil, but it very quickly becomes cheesy. The lightning bolts firing from Palpatine's hands sound like bass shots in a dubstep progression, and he dies by Rey reflecting his lightning with Luke and Leia's lightsabers. No sword dueling or anything, it's basically the same fight we saw at the end of the last Harry Potter movie, but Star Wars this time. The Knights of Ren make an appearance, and for those of you who don't know, they are these twisted religious mercenaries that follow a diabolical creed, and they were formerly led by Ren. Each of the mercenaries are cruel, violent, merciless killers that act like marauders or Vikings, decimating pretty much anything in their way. These guys all show up in the last battle and are knocked aside by Kylo Ren or Ben Solo as if they were stormtroopers. Finally, when all looks like it's lost to Palpatine's mega fleet of Death Star weapon-equipped Star Destroyers, the power of friendship comes through and saves the day. Yeah, Princess Luna was my favorite pony. I shouldn't keep that in. And that's it. I skipped over a lot of the details, but when I look at this amalgamation of events, a lot of it did happen basically as fast as I went over them. Character needs something, another character has one line that mentions that they know exactly where to find that thing. A scene of action happens, and rinse and repeat until the end of the movie. Several hours worth of content just crammed into a 2-hour time space, all to undo what The Last Jedi did and didn't do. The end result is a movie that is largely forgettable because no time was spent on letting its story elements linger. With so many notable similarities to other parts of the franchise as well, it's pretty easy to lose the plot amid other pieces that do what The Rise of Skywalker did but better. If you want a more satisfying ending to this trilogy, just watch Return of the Jedi. It's better paced than this movie, and you get to see stormtroopers get mauled by furries. It's like California.